I've been away from you a long time.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Adath Israel Congregation's Zoom presentation featuring Howard Mednick, classical music DJ, and our presenter of I Like a Gershwin Tune, How About You? For those who don't know me, I am Sam Chaim. I'm a member of the board here at Adath Israel. And I'd first like to acknowledge that these are difficult times for everyone in our community and beyond. And we hope that you and your loved ones are well and safe. Let me add how grateful we are for the efforts of everyone involved to keeping us that way. We're delighted that so many of you have literally taken an interlude in your day to enjoy a bit of culture, and what could be more uplifting than Gershwin. Adath Israel is pleased to host this program as one of many varied topics in our schedule, from religion to politics, finance to culture, and today, the arts. At the end, we will have time for a brief Q&A, and if you'd like to contribute a question, please use the Q&A and not the chat. I'm very pleased to introduce a good personal friend and our presenter today, Howard Mednick. Howard is the creator of today's program, and over the past few years has developed other classical music appreciation presentations, such as classical music and pop culture, spoofs in the classics, animals in classics, and more. You're in for a real treat this afternoon, and I promise to get Howard going in just a moment. But first, let me share some tidbits about Howard so you'll understand why I was surprised to learn of his love for the classics. I've known Howard for almost 40 years, since we became neighbors in Thornhill and raised our families about four doors from each other. He has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And until recently, I was unaware of Howard's passion for music and the classical genre in particular. You see, the Howard I know is a hard-bodied, formidable, and serious athlete, which I learned the hard way bumping into him during our many years of pickup basketball. Howard is a retired computer systems consultant that specialized in big data after graduating from McGill. While there, he played football and was co-captain in 1971. As his neighbor, I could see him running, not jogging, almost daily for years. Howard was also a dedicated swimmer who inspired his son, Avi, to take up the sport. Avi would go on to coach the Toronto JCC Maccabi team for kids aged 13 to 16 from 2017 to 2019. Naturally, Howard volunteered to be his assistant coach. So you understand my surprise when Howard told me he was a classical music DJ. He has been an avid listener and student of classical orchestral music for many years. More recently, he has fashioned his passion into a hobby that inescapably brings smiles to people's faces, and Howard has very generously devoted his time to our seniors and residential institutions. Howard has presented at Baycrest, Ryerson's Life Institute, public libraries, social groups, synagogues and churches in the GTA, and more recently has become in demand at similar venues in Israel. Howard takes a lighthearted, creative approach to his programs, often with off-the-wall topics. We hope you will come away from today's program with an appreciation for classical music in a way you had not imagined, as Howard focuses on being informative, entertaining, and fun. It gives me great pleasure to turn the screen and the mic over to you now, Howard. Take us on that musical ride we spoke about.
Let's get right into my topic on I Like a Gershwin Tune, How About You? And I think you'll all recognize that line. It came from a song written in 1941, a couple of years after Gershwin's death, and I'll get into that shortly, by Burton Lane and Ralph Freed for a movie musical they did called Babes in Arms. But it shows you that long after Gershwin's death, he remained a real major force in the music world. And even to this day, he still is quite popular, as you'll see. A few facts about George Gershwin himself. He was born in 1898 to Russian immigrant parents. His name was at that time Jacob Gershowitz. His parents had recently come over from Russia, and he was brought up in the streets of Brooklyn and Manhattan. His parents moved around quite a bit, and he wasn't a great student. He roamed the streets, tussling and, roughing it up with all his neighbors, as a lot of kids did then. But he eventually learned to play the piano. His parents wanted to bring a piano into the house. He had an older brother, Ira, who I'll discuss shortly as well, and a younger brother and a younger sister as well. But George was the, he's sort of the second child, and really, quite a man about town, even at a very young age. When they got the piano, they realized that he was a real prodigy on it. He took to it like they couldn't believe, and really adapted himself to it very, very quickly. Very much like Mozart, who also was a child prodigy in that respect. And as a result, he was able to really make something of himself. At the age of 15, he dropped out of school and became what's known as a plugger on Tin Pan Alley. Now, a plugger is somebody who sits down at the piano, and people who have written songs will come over to him and say, hey, can you play this song and impress so-and-so so that I can make a recording of it, or or sell it as sheet music, or use it someplace. And that was Gershwin's job at the age of 15, sitting down at the piano and doing stuff like that. But that experience by itself enabled him to learn how to improvise, and I'll discuss his improvisation skills a little bit later. Nevertheless, he still did have some proper formal training on the piano, but for the most part, he was very much self-taught, and really, developed his own technique, and it was quite a masterful technique at that, and really made something of himself. Basically, in summary, he really defines the American songbook, because he covers 4 different genres or styles of music: popular, jazz, opera, and classical. And I'm going to touch on each one of these during the course of my program here, because really he was at the top in each one of these fields from an American point of view. One other thing to note about American music, especially at that time in the late teens and early 20s, but before World War I, a lot of American music was basically they copied a lot of European styles, and they liked the sort of the Viennese style of music, and that was very much in the American mind until World War I. After World War I, American music dropped everything from Europe, or well, particularly from Austria, with whom they fought during World War I, and they started to develop their own style of music. And jazz, ragtime, things like that started to become popular, along with the Broadway scene. The musical plays scene became extremely popular and started to grow. As immigrants came to the US started to develop their own style. And that's why Gershwin was a very important factor in developing this American songbook. He died at a very young age in 1937 as a result of a brain tumor, unfortunately. It just came on very quickly. And at that time, they really didn't have the resources to manage it properly. And he died a very untimely death, but still left behind a great legacy of music that we're gonna sample today. So let's start with the popular music. And in this picture, you'll see George Gershwin sitting at the piano along with his brother, Ira Gershwin. And they became a fabulous songwriting team in the 1920s and 30s for these just burgeoning Broadway musicals, which started to become very, very popular, particularly in New York. There were a lot of composers writing for these musicals, and the musicals themselves, really each one of them had very little along the ways of a plot line, or you could hardly call it a plot at all. And the way these composers worked is that they would write songs, they would try and put the songs together, and they would call it a musical. And if the composer had a song that he liked, but it somehow got left out of the musical, he would take that same song and put it into another musical. They were all sort of transferable in that respect. Examples of some of the musicals that the Gershwin brothers put together: Lady Be Good, Okay, Strike Up the Band, Funny Face, Girl Crazy, Of Thee I Sing, and a whole host of others. All these were done in the 20s and 30s by the Gershwin brothers, and they became really, really famous. And why not? Now, we're going to hear a medley of songs sung by Julie Andrews. Now, and of a lot of the songs from these musicals. And what I want you to be aware of is that, hey, these tunes are still kind of popular today. They have not gone out of style. Now, full disclosure, I think Julie Andrews is the best entertainer of virtually of all time. She can do anything and everything at its best, and it's really a pleasure to listen to her. So we're going to hear Julie Andrews singing a medley of Gershwin songs with the orchestra by Andre Previn and the orchestra behind her. So let's relax, pretend you're going to a concert, and let's listen to Julie Andrews. Here we go. There's a great medley of famous Gershwin tunes. I'm sure you recognize them all, and they're really good. She goes on to sing a bunch of tunes from Porgy and Bess, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But really, that is your American songbook right there. And it's still popular today, and really those songs do not grow old. So let's move on from popular music to jazz. And as I said before, jazz was just starting to become popular through the 1920s, particularly in America, obviously. And many of these same songs that Gershwin wrote became jazz standards. And really what he would do is change the beat, change the syncopation a little bit, and all of a sudden you've got a great jazz tune. Now, I'm gonna play a little bit, just a minute, because we have limited time. I have to cut some of these excerpts short, but I wanna play about a minute of the song Fascinatin' Rhythm. It's from the play Lady Be Good, and this is sung by the great female jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald. And I just want you to get a feel for the beat that Gershwin's music has in this particular version sung by Ella Fitzgerald. So let's just listen to a little bit of this to get us into a jazz. Okay, so again, I just wanted you to get a bit of a feel for that sort of jazz and syncopation. And we're going to, I'm going to skip that one, but I'm going to go to the other major big jazz song that Gershwin wrote, I Got Rhythm. But here we're going to watch and listen to this video, and you're going to hear George Gershwin himself talk and see Gershwin play parts of it. There's a lot of old black and white films here, home movies, so to speak, of Gershwin and some of his friends. And you can see what he's like. A couple things to note here is that Gershwin's going to explain how he gets his variations, or how he would go about making variations in a particular piece of music, because this originally was in the musical Girl Crazy, but then now he turns it into a jazz piece with variations. And listen how Gershwin explains a couple of these variations. Watch him play the piano, and also watch some of the home movies, so to speak, that are taken of Gershwin. You can see him play tennis. He's a very good athlete on top of everything else. He was quite a ladies' man, although he never married, but there was nothing that he liked better than going to a party, sitting down at the piano and just playing music, variations, and just having a lot of fun. So let's watch this video of I Got Rhythm and its variations, and you'll get a bit of a feel for the life of George Gershwin. So there you get a great example of George's jazz style, and a really good look at what he was like as a person. Life of the party, fun-loving guy, great athlete, just enjoying himself at the piano all the time. So there's a good example of George's legacy as a jazz composer. Okay, let's move on to Porgy and Bess. This is the famous opera that he and Ira Gershwin put together. And really what happened with this was that the music is obviously by George Gershwin. The libretto, or the text of the storyline, basically, was by this fellow DuBose Hayward, who was a fellow a white person who grew up in South Carolina. I read someplace that one of his ancestors was a signatory to the Declaration of Independence. So he was a longtime South Carolina resident. And he wrote this story about Porgy and Bess, about the Black people in this Gullah district of South Carolina. And the lyrics were by both Ira Gershwin and DuBose Hayward. George read the novel that DuBose Hayward put together. And from that novel, he decided that he would he would write an opera on this, and he got it into his head. He went down to South Carolina and he got a feel for what what life was like there among the blacks in that area of South Carolina. The storyline of Porgy and Bess is Porgy, who's a disabled street beggar, really tries to rescue Bess from her lover Crown, who's not a nice guy. And there's another drug dealer in the crowd, sporting life. So it's really a kind of a love story among the black people there. Depicts what life was like there in South Carolina. And again, the music is really brings this to bear. And Gershwin himself was, George Gershwin himself really was the driving force behind putting this together. When they finished the opera, the New York Met would not put it on, and George Gershwin insisted on having an all-black cast. He didn't want anybody doing this in blackface. He wanted it to be original, and it was. And he managed to recruit a cast. Who was it? A fellow Todd Duncan was the first Porgy, and Anne Brown was the first Bess, and they put this together. And it didn't last very long, and it's been very difficult to get remakes of it because you have to have a very large cast of black opera singers, which not the easiest thing to do. However, the New York Met did put it on last year, and I'm going to listen to this. First of all, before we get to everything, there is a piece that sometimes you'll hear among classical music radio stations called Catfish Row. The sign of a great music from an opera is that they take the highlights from the various musical pieces in the opera and they put it together for a symphonic version. And sometimes you'll hear a thing called Catfish Row by George Gershwin, and it is all the musical highlights from Porgy and Bess, an instrumental version only to be played by an orchestra. We don't have time for that, but I do want to get into arguably the most famous tune from Porgy and Bess, Summertime. And this is a version from that recent New York Met production. I saw it last February. And this is Golda Schultz, who is actually a black South African woman, singing Summertime from Porgy and Bess. I'm sure you'll all recognize this tune. Okay, so there you have Summertime from the recent New York Met production of Porgy and Bess. Again, when you listen to this stuff, this is opera music on par with the greatest opera composers of all, Verdi, Puccini, Mozart, whoever. It is that good. It really is. And we're going to listen to another piece. This is my favorite from the opera. Bess, You Is My Woman Now. And in this little scene, this is from a production that was done in London, England in the 1990s. And it's Bess is being jilted by her lover Crown, who runs off with another woman, but Porgy comes over and to console Bess. And this is how they start their affair, Porgy and Bess together. So this is Bess, You Is My Woman Now, with Willard White singing Porgy and Cynthia Hayman singing Bess. And this will just grab you. So listen carefully. The point I want to make here is that you will not find a better duet in all of opera and all of music than that, what you just heard. It is just fantastic. One other piece from Porgy and Bess that I want to play for you, or have you listen to, It Ain't Necessarily So. The production you're going to see is there was a revival of Porgy and Bess in London, England in 2015, and there was an award show where they put this particular piece on, an excerpt from that particular version in London. And I want to see if you can recognize the tune behind It Ain't Necessarily So. So listen carefully to the melody and watch this because it's a lot of fun and very, very interesting. It Ain't Necessarily So. Did you recognize that tune? Everybody out there, think about it. Next time you get called for an aliyah to the Torah, what are you going to sing? The bracha that you sing. Baruch Adonai Hamvorach. It ain't necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so, but be careful because the next time you get called for an aliyah to the Torah, don't start singing Jonah, he lived in a whale. He made his home in that fish's abdomen. It ain't necessarily so. What did Gershwin do? He picked up music that he heard in the streets as a kid, or when he went to synagogue as a kid, and he incorporated that into into some of the music that he wrote, in this case in Porgy and Bess. And doesn't it make perfect sense that when you're talking about the Bible with, Moses was found in a stream, David beat Goliath, and so on and so forth, and Jonah lived in a whale, you use that blessing from the Torah to be your guiding music. And this is exactly what Gershwin did, and it's really something. Anyways, I want to move on to the last little bit, which is the classical music element of Gershwin. And you'll see on the left a self-portrait of that Gershwin did. He was also a talented artist. I mean, what couldn't this guy do? And he did this self-portrait of himself, and he's as you can see, he's quite a talented guy. Now, he did, as I said at the beginning, he did have some formal music training, but he really was great at improvising and picking it up on his own. That was his strength. But he always felt that he kind of had an inferiority complex, that he always really wanted to write, classical music like he heard the big classical composers of the day. So he had this inferiority complex. So what does he do? When the French composer Maurice Ravel came to New York in 1928, George Gershwin met him, and he asked Ravel if he could study with him, if this great French composer can teach him a few things. Ravel replied, "Why would you want to be a second-rate Ravel when you can be a first-rate Gershwin?" Gershwin didn't realize how great his music really was. Even his, through his whole repertoire, all the stuff that he composed, it was really, really great. The piece you heard at the beginning as you were signing on, which was Rhapsody in Blue, was composed in 1924. And everybody knew Rhapsody in Blue, and they heard this as one of an early classical piece by Gershwin, and it is tops. There's, Ravel heard it, and he couldn't think of anything better than what Gershwin wrote with Rhapsody in Blue. In another case, Gershwin asked Igor Stravinsky, the great Russian composer, for help. And Igor asked George, "Well, how much money do you make?" And George told him. And Stravinsky's response to that was, "It's me who should be taking lessons from you," because Gershwin just had it all. He was first rate in every aspect. I want to play, for our last little piece here, I want to play a bit from An American in Paris. Now, Gershwin went to Paris in 1928, and he traveled around there, and he got a feeling for the sights and sounds of Paris. He came back and he wrote this piece, which has elements of French Parisian style music along with American style music. And I want you to listen to this. And I'm not gonna play the whole thing, but I'm gonna stop it right at a point where there's a piece that you should recognize again. Again, it's got great full orchestral feeling to it and great spontaneity, a little bit of that jazz element thrown in. Gershwin does it all with, again, great music with a full symphony orchestra behind you. It's really great. The orchestra in this case is the Israel Philharmonic from Rishon LeZion. They're a Rishon LeZion branch of the Israel Philharmonic, playing an American in Paris by Gershwin. I'm going to have to stop it there, but I hope you got that last little tune from the trumpeter there, because that is Bess, you is my woman now. So you can see how Gershwin wrote An American in Paris in 1928, but used that same nice little melody and turned it into that beautiful duet in the opera that we just heard. Okay, I've run a little bit longer than I should have. Last word from Gershwin: true music must repeat the thought and inspirations of the people and the time. My people are Americans, and my time is today. And I thank you all for joining me in this classical music DJ presentation on Gershwin. You can feel free to contact me or visit my website. And I hope you had a lot of fun. I certainly did in presenting this to you. So thank you very much, and happy Hanukkah to everybody.
Okay, Howard, thank you so much for a wonderful hour that we spent together. Obviously not enough. It's really a uplifting and fun situation. So thank you for all of your inspiration today. So a couple of people asked for how would you compare, first of all, did Gershwin compose any Jewish music?
Aside from necessarily so, I'm not sure. Not specific Jewish music. Like it said at the end, he was very much an American. He was very involved with, becoming American, as all those immigrants were, growing up in New York, in Brooklyn and Manhattan, Lower East Side of Manhattan. I'm not aware of any specific Jewish music like that he wrote. He was, you got to look at the Broadway, the Broadway musicals, the jazz, and his classical works. That's the extent of his repertoire. Maybe had he lived longer, he might have. I don't know.
Okay. And we've had questions from two different sides asking for comparisons, if you will, to Gershwin, to Beethoven, and also to Mozart.
Okay. Good thing that you brought up Beethoven, because remember, tomorrow is the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. So beware of that. You'll hear a lot of Beethoven if you listen to classical music radio stations. How does he compare? It's tough to compare different composers from different generations. So really, there's their styles are different. This is the whole thing that I found out when I started doing my research on all this, is that the whole context under which they composed music was very, very different. From Mozart in the latter part of the 18th century to Beethoven essentially in the early part of the 19th century. Their whole focus was very, very different. The technology also was very, very different. When you listen to earlier composers, everything from beyond, everybody basically before Mozart or before Haydn, from the Baroque period, their instruments were of not of great quality. And of course, they didn't have the acoustics and the electronics that we have today. So the sound was radically different. It's tough to get into early Baroque music, like from Bach, because their instruments were very, very different. So it's really hard to compare from one generation to another. Yet from an American perspective, I would say a North American perspective, or perhaps a more modern 20th century perspective, Gershwin was at the tops. He was the Beethoven, effectively the Beethoven of his time in the United States.
Thanks for that, Howard. Can you also contrast Leonard Bernstein to Gershwin?
I think Bernstein certainly picked up from Gershwin. Bernstein was born in 1918. So as a youngster, he might have heard a little bit of Gershwin. He would have been aware of Gershwin for sure. But Bernstein followed on in composing Broadway tunes, although the style of Broadway music changed radically from Gershwin's day into the time where Bernstein started to write. There's a whole, I do a whole lecture on Oscar Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and it was Oscar Hammerstein essentially who changed the whole style of Broadway musicals. As I said before, Gershwin's tunes in his musicals were really bright, uplifting, but you could shift one to another. It doesn't matter what the musical was. You can put any of his songs in any of his musicals. That's the way they were. But hey, you can't take a song from Oklahoma and put it into South Pacific. It just won't work because the musicals are radically different. So Bernstein certainly picked up on that and advanced it. And Bernstein just advanced the whole concept of music in terms of, and I do a two-part presentation on Bernstein, because he was the tops in terms of a conductor, as a conductor, as a teacher, as a performer, and as a composer. And he had his own little style of composing, which was a little bit different from Gershwin's, but much more, a little bit more advanced into the modern day.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, Howard. So I'm going to wrap it up here. We hope that everyone found the program entertaining and interesting. I don't know how you couldn't. And perhaps we can have you back again soon, Howard, to give us another twist on classical music.
Love to do it. Thank you.
A recording of the presentation will be posted to the ADATH website in a couple of days for you all to enjoy again and share. And perhaps we can pick up on some of the videos that you missed. I'd like to acknowledge with sincere appreciation to you, Howard, for donating your honorarium to Baycrest. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
And thank you also to the Adult Education Committee and the Adult Israel staff for putting on this afternoon's program. Watch for news about these upcoming programs. Tal Becker, legal counsel for the peace treaty between Israel, the Emirates, and Bahrain. Richard Kravitz, President Emeritus, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. And Erwin Simon, a serial entrepreneur who founded Hain Celestial and currently is the CEO of Afria, of a leading marijuana product company. We look forward to having you join us virtually again at Israel programs and maybe perhaps one day soon physically. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for attending today. And as we conclude our program, we wish you a freilich and happy Hanukkah. Please stay well and stay safe.